and welcome to Naturalizing Disaster, Nature, Vulnerability, and Social History. As many of you know, this is a three-part series sponsored by the Center for International Studies and the Program on Global Environment. The series examines the dynamic between nature, dislocation, and communities in an increasing vulnerable world. So tonight's event is an integral piece of this. This is the second out of the three. It's Governing Disaster Policy and Practice, and explores the challenges of assessing risk, mitigating hardship, and administering disaster management projects around the world. The third event, just to let you know, is on May 21st, same place and same time. And that is Disaster as Inequality, Equity, Justice, and Rights. So a very good follow-up to what we're going to hear today. So we're very, very pleased and honored to welcome Dr. Apurva Sanghi here, who is the lead economist at the World Bank in the Poverty Reduction and Economic Management Network of the Economic Policy and Debt Department. He holds degrees in physics and economics and a PhD from the University of Chicago, and I just discovered he taught in the economics department here in the 90s, taught environmental economics, which I know many of you have taken. He has worked on developing topics ranging from infrastructure and climate change to microfinance and agriculture. He's the lead author for the IPCC Special Report on Extreme Events, and also the UN World Bank publication, which I know some of you have seen, Natural Hazards, UnNatural Disasters, and the Economics of Effective Prevention, which is what he will be speaking to tonight. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Sanghi.
Thank you, Sabina. Thank you. So thanks for the wonderful introduction, and it's nice to be back in Hyde Park, where, at least when I was here in the 90s, the saying was, there's no place to hide, no place to park. So I don't know if that's still the case, but it's delightful to be here. So let me begin my presentation by showing you this picture. Now, this picture is a tale of two countries and a border between them. So on my far right, on my immediate right, is a country that has successfully preserved its forests. You can see they're vivid, verdant, vibrant. On my far right is a country whose hill slopes are stripped, stark, and silent. Now, both these countries are part of the same island and exposed to many of the same storms and hurricanes. Yet storm damage in the country, oops, I pressed something. On my far right, Haiti is far more than the storm damage in its neighbor, the Dominican Republic. So to give you a few examples, while the Haiti earthquake of 2010 is fresh in our minds, we may not remember other disasters. So in 2004, over 5,000 people lost their lives from hurricanes in Haiti, whereas the same hurricanes took about 700 lives in the Dominican Republic. And again, in 2008, over 700 died in Haiti, compared to about a dozen or so in the Dominican Republic. So as this picture shows so clearly, deforestation is a visible difference. So massive deforestation in Haiti makes rains wash mud, rock, debris into towns and villages. But why is there so much more deforestation in Haiti? While that may be the visible difference, as we say in our book, the quality of institutions is a less visible one. So Haiti's institutions have suffered for decades from misrule and unraveled the social fabric of shared relationships, norms, and values that encourage communities to come up with their own prevention measures. So this story basically brings out 3 points. First, hazards are natural, but disasters are not. They are unnatural. Second, preventing the death and damage from natural hazards is essential and possible. And third, strong institutions are crucial for prevention. But these institutions go beyond specific labels, as we say in the book. Now, for far too long, the disaster field has been dominated by the R's: relief, recovery, reconstruction, after a disaster strikes. Not enough by the P's, prevention and preparedness. To give you an example, Mozambique in 2002 asked donors for about $3 million to prepare for anticipated flooding. And it got not even half that amount. But after the flood struck, the same donors gave $100 million in relief alone, and pledged another $450 million for recovery and reconstruction. So this report attempts to restore the balance between the P's and the R's and emphasizes that prevention pays if done right. Now, a few words on the intended audience. I'll be very honest with you. Most global reports are basically written for the gratification of the authors. Okay? And in this report, we wanted to have a very specific audience. And if you look at it, it's bookended by two memos. An opening memo to the concerned Minister of Finance and a closing memo to the concerned citizen. That's basically what this audience, what the target audience is for this work. Busy finance ministers who are constantly pressed by parochial sectoral advocates to increase funding to their sectors, and of course concerned citizens like you, me, and everybody else, for whom this report brings out the experience of other cities, communities, and citizens. So we're all concerned citizens here, but for the rest of the talk, I'd like to indulge in a bit of role-playing. I'd like you to imagine that you are a finance minister. So I'd like you to put a finance minister hat on. And I, the speaker, will motivate you, the finance minister, why I think you should care about disasters in the first place. Second, what you can do about preventing disasters. Again, you may not prevent the hazards, but you can prevent disasters. And third, give you a glimpse about what the future of the disaster prevention landscape is and what you, the finance minister, can do to keep this future manageable. All right? So let's start with the first one. Why should you care about disasters? As a finance minister, if a disaster strikes, the first question you're probably going to ask is, what happens to my fiscal deficit? That's the most immediate, short-run consideration. So one study looked at disasters in over 140 countries in over 20 years. And it found that the budget deficit in developing countries could be as high as 1 percentage points for large disasters. Now, 1% may not seem like a lot. But to put it in context, the GDP of a small country like Mali is $1 billion. That was in 2010. 1% of that is 10 million. Malaria nets cost about $5 a piece. So 1% of GDP of a country like Mali works out to be about 2 million malaria nets. When this report came out, Pakistan was in the throes of a devastating flood. And there, the then Prime Minister said the budget deficit for the flood crisis could be as high as up to 7% just because of the floods. It's a real live issue in many developing countries. Now, you may think that as a finance minister, well, if it's just a fiscal deficit issue, at least in developing countries, donors can step in and fill the gap. But as we discuss in the report, through detailed country case studies from Bangladesh, Dominica, Malawi, we find that donors do provide money, but they do by simply relabeling the funds so that money is not additional. So aid may not boost what governments, finance ministers have to spend, so you have to ultimately rely on taxing your citizens and spending accordingly. So the finding that disasters can adversely affect the fiscal deficit, the fiscal position, is a relevant one for you, dear finance minister. And the second question on the finance minister's mind is more medium term. How do disasters affect my growth rates? So we did some original research and we looked at disasters in over 90 countries over 45 years. We broke down the growth effects of disasters by sector and by hazard. We looked at not only what happens in the immediate aftermath, but what happens to growth 3, 4, 5 years after disasters. Now, this is the first time such a disaggregated sectoral analysis had been done, and this is what we found. So medium-term growth is generally lower, but not always. Now, this is a bit intriguing. How can growth actually increase after disasters? And it's a simple answer, and the answer is after a major disaster, reconstruction can create a huge economic boom. So that's what explains the positive growth, especially in the industrial subsector and overall GDP growth. So there are cases when output actually rises after a disaster. But these results were for all the disasters we looked at. When we shrunk the analysis to look at only severe disasters, look at what happens to the adverse effect of droughts on agriculture, as well as storms. In the case of droughts, the adverse effect more than doubles. And in the case of the positive effects of growth, they just disappear, poof. So, severe disasters have adverse effects on your economy, regardless of hazard type.
How do you define a severe disaster?
Sorry?
How do you define a severe disaster?
How do I define a disaster?
A severe disaster.
A severe disaster, there are some technical specifications. So depending on the damage and deaths that a disaster creates. So this is another relevant finding for the finance minister. Yeah?
This is a question about your metrics. So how does the growth post-disaster compare to growth of GDPs worldwide? Is it greater or lesser than general GDP growth?
Well, these are country-specific analyses, so it's difficult estimating the impact of a disaster on global growth. And if you were to do that,
I meant just in terms of if the growth of the GDP was less than the growth would have been otherwise, or if it was more than the growth would have been otherwise.
yeah, so that's basically what we're estimating here. So if you didn't have, say, a severe disaster, agricultural growth would be roughly 2.5% higher than it otherwise is. So that's exactly it. Great. So the fact that severe disasters or large disasters have an effect not only on your immediate fiscal deficit, but also 5 years hence as a relevant finding for you, the finance minister. By the way, this is also a good place to remember that output or GDP is not the same as welfare. Now, output may well go up after a disaster, but it's really in the accounting sense because you have revenues flowing in from reconstruction that creates a boom. Welfare or well-being of those affected undoubtedly falls. Disasters can cause malnourishment, they can cause psychological trauma. These are all tangible aspects of well-being that are not captured in GDP statistics. So in fact, Peter Barr, a great development economist, once said that if GDP were a perfect measuring rod of welfare, we would all rejoice the birth of a farm animal because it raises farm productivity, and bemoan the birth of our own children because you're spending a lot more raising your child. So in the report, we discuss various multidimensional aspects of disasters. So we discuss how even temporary deprivation from disasters could permanently stunt growth and lower cognitive abilities in young children. And these are persistent, permanent effects. So disasters in the world of Amartya Sen reduce the freedom to achieve the actual livings that one can have a reason to value. And it is precisely avoiding these adverse consequences on the economy and welfare why you, the finance minister, should care. So the question is, how do you realize these benefits of prevention? And does prevention even pay in the first place? And here I had the following 3 messages. So message 1 is prevention pays, but you don't always have to pay more for prevention. Okay? The second message is, well, you don't always have to pay more for prevention, but there are certain cases where increasing public spending is warranted. And the third is, beware. If somebody comes to you and says prevention is easy, don't be fooled. Because there's no single effective measure that can increase prevention. So you cannot rest on a single measure or simple slogans. Now, this may seem obvious, but to state the obvious is to call it into question, as you will see as I proceed. So I'm going to elaborate on each of these 3 messages, take them one by one and go in depth. Yeah? Okay, so the first message is prevention pays, but you don't always have to pay more for prevention. So let's start with the first half of the message, that prevention pays. Now, what's the evidence that prevention pays? Let me tell you another thing about global reports. Global reports are supposed to come out with a measure, with some quantification of something like when $1 spent on this yields Y dollars of benefit. but I believe such measures are useless. They are great for advocacy purposes, for fundraising purposes, but useless for policy from a policy perspective. Why? Because even if you came up with such a global estimate, it's meaningless for you, the finance minister, who's struggling with a disaster that's just struck in your country. And clearly, the cost-benefit of prevention would be very different. So the cost-benefit of preventing floods in New Orleans would be very different from the cost-benefit of preventing floods or the effects of floods in Bangladesh. So we took a different route, even though we were under a lot of pressure to come up with a headline-generating global number. What we did was we calculated the prevention benefits in 4 different country contexts and different hazards. So for example, we calculate the benefit-cost ratio of protecting doors and windows in wood frame houses in St. Lucia in the context of hurricanes. And we looked at other specific preventive measures in 3 other places, and we find that in the case of St. Lucia, it's plus 1.5, and it's even higher in these other places. By the way, this is just one slide, but let me tell you that we collaborated with some of the best economists, not just in the bank, but world over, even in the US, so Wharton Business School, EASA, which is based out of Vienna, the Risk Management Solution, and RMS. And we developed a probabilistic cost-benefit methodology to be able to do this at a very granular level. So there's a lot of technical things that have happened behind these seemingly glossy slides. So these numbers are the result of over a year and a half worth of work by my colleagues who went to these places to detail analyses, even some surveys to come up with these numbers. So clearly prevention pays, at least in these contexts. But we ask a deeper question. If prevention pays, why don't people take on more prevention? And that's related to the second part of my first message, that you don't always have to pay more for prevention. And I'm going to give 3 examples, none of which require you, the finance minister, to spend more. But all of them would greatly increase prevention. So the first is letting markets work, letting land and housing markets work, because distorted markets reduce individuals' incentives to prevent. Now, in most topics, if you put, the joke about economists, you put 6 economists in a room, you get 7 views, right? But there are a few topics that economists agree on, and rent controls is one of them. So Krugman says analysis of rent control is among the best understood and least controversial topics in economics. Now, rent controls are pervasive in over 40-plus countries, including in the US, in New York, San Francisco, and I'm sure some parts of Chicago too. But what's the connection between rent controls and disaster prevention, you might ask? So this is the connection. Imagine you're a landlord in rent-controlled Mumbai, India. Now, you may fix the occasional broken doorknob or the mailbox, but what incentive do you as a landlord really have to undertake any major structural repairs to make your building safer for your tenants if you cannot recoup that additional expense through higher rents? So it's no wonder that dozens of buildings in Mumbai fall every year during monsoons. Another distortion is insecure ownership, which again reduces the incentives to make long-term prevention investments. So imagine you're living on this piece of land and you don't have secure title. And you're probably living under the constant threat of eviction by your local corrupt police, most likely. So what incentive could you possibly have to undertake any improvements on your land or to your house, if you could call it that? So what is the evidence that providing secure title helps? In the case of Peru, land titling was associated with almost a 70% increase in housing renovation within 4 years. So we discussed these and other distortions such as distorted floor area ratios, skewed tax structures, and so on, and point out how it's often the poor who bear the brunt of distorted land and housing policies, because they are the ones who get zoned out of land and housing in the first place. So letting markets work, just allowing them to work, would greatly help prevention, and you don't have to spend anything out of your pocket as a finance minister. So it doesn't require you to spend more. Let me give you another example. The second example is reorienting existing public spending. Now, with many caveats and heartaches, we estimated how much of spending is pre versus post-disaster in 4 countries: Colombia, Indonesia, Mexico, and Nepal. This is what we found for Mexico. That's what pre-disaster spending looks like over a 10-year time frame, roughly. And that's what post-disaster spending looks like. Okay? Now, 3 things jump out of this picture. One is clearly pre-disaster spending on average is significantly lower than post-disaster spending. Post-disaster spending fluctuates much more than pre-disaster spending. But we cannot really conclude that there's too much post-disaster spending and there's too little pre-disaster spending. You cannot draw that conclusion from this diagram. And results from the other 3 countries I mentioned are similar. But how much governments spend on prevention is perhaps a wrong question. A better question to ask is, are governments spending effectively? And the short answer is no. Let me elaborate. In many countries, spending is often poorly allocated or just ineffective. So, for example, governments, including in the US, routinely neglect maintaining even their existing infrastructure. So my colleagues in the World Bank did a fabulous study looking at infrastructure spending in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is what they found. So the red bars are for specific subsectors, but the yellow bar gives you a sense of the average. So over 30% of sub-Saharan African infrastructure assets are in need of maintenance or are in need of upkeep just because of poor maintenance. Right? So reorienting existing public spending towards maintaining roads so they don't get washed away, painting steel bridges so they don't crack or corrode, cleaning your drains so they don't get clogged up would greatly help prevention. And it doesn't cost you a dime. It is reorienting even existing public spending. So that's the second example of how prevention doesn't have to cost, or you don't have to pay more for prevention. Now, the third example I want to give is something even more basic, and that is information. That doesn't require reorienting existing spending. And we often talk about people making informed choices, right? But as somebody said, "In God we trust, but please give us information." Right? So without information, without disclosing where the floodplains are or where the fault plains are, disclosing that sort of information helps everybody, from landowners to individuals, to insurance companies, and even to landlords. Yet this seemingly simple act of making public information available and accessible does not happen, even when most of this information is funded by public sources. Why? Security, privacy, and commercial reasons are often invoked. Now, taking photographs from aeroplanes in some countries is illegal in 2013. And this is a legacy of a World War I measure. But detailed and sensitive images are already available through Google Maps and Google Earth or whatever have you. So the fact that governments still try to restrict this sort of information is preposterous. You know, a Central American country, which unfortunately I cannot disclose, ironically, since we're talking about information, discovered a fault line under a major population area, but that information has still not been made public or disclosed, because they're afraid that that could have a severe effect on on their property prices. Excuse me. And as we discussed in Ethiopia, being ill-informed is one of the main avoidable reasons from starvation, for starvation from droughts. But this is not just a developing country phenomenon. It happens in developed countries as well. It happens in the US. So even though FEMA has updated coastal maps of the US Gulf, it cannot get the coastal communities to readily adopt them because such information would reduce property prices. And in Australia, insurers have pointed at inadequate mapping for lack of flood cover in Queensland when the floods struck a few years back. So the message here is disclosing existing information does not cost more, just as reorienting existing public spending doesn't cost more, and insulating land and housing markets don't cost more. So to recap message one, prevention pays, but you don't always have to pay more for prevention. Now, let me move on to the second message. You don't always have to pay more for prevention, but increasing public spending in some areas is warranted. And even small increases, moderate increases can have a huge impact. That's the second message. So, let me show you. This is a picture of Jakarta. In order to protect themselves from flooding, residents in low-lying levels of Jakarta raise their houses. They build them on stilts. But they also draw water through boreholes, causing the ground to subside. Even knowing this, they have no choice if the government does not provide them with safe piped water. So it's not because of ignorance. Likewise, we discussed that people, often the poor, live in risky areas not because they are myopic or fatalistic, but as a location decision to be closer to work. So simply providing good transport services between safer areas and job sites could obviate the need to locate in risky areas. So the larger point is individuals generally decide well, but their prevention actions depend a lot on the public services that governments do, or in many cases do not provide. Now, these services are typically underfunded in many countries, and more spending on them is warranted. So here's a plea to you, dear Finance Minister, increase public spending for transport services and the like, piped water transport services. Now here's another area. Now we all realize the importance of early warning systems in saving lives and the role that weather forecasting has to play. So let me show you how weather forecasts have become increasingly accurate over time since 1980s. So this is the accuracy of a 3-day forecast. It's almost 100% accurate. Okay? And that blue line is for countries in the northern hemisphere. See how quickly countries in the southern hemisphere have caught up. And that's true not just for 3-day forecasts, but also 5, 7, 10-day forecasts. And the potential benefits are huge. Benefit-cost ratios are in double digits in many countries. So all countries should be able to benefit from these advances in accurate weather forecasting. But many do not. And I'll show you this map. These blue dots represent something called synoptic observations. So countries, basically these blue dots are a proxy for countries that are benefiting from these advances in weather accuracy, and there are quite a few. The next click of the remote, I'm going to show you all the non-blue dots, which will give you an indication of countries in the 21st century who are still not benefiting. And you can see where they are. Some of them are most of them are in sub-Saharan Africa, developing countries of Latin America, but also some in Australia and some in the US too. So why is this? It's because at least in the developing countries, many weather forecasting agencies suffer from lack of visibility and insufficient capacity. So more funding for such low visible, low capacity agencies would help. By the way, this is not true just for climate-related hazards. Even though Japan and Indonesia have similar seismic exposure, and even though Indonesia is 5 times bigger than Japan, Japan is equipped with more than 1,000 seismographs and 1,230 GPS units to monitor crust deformation, compared to a paltry 160 seismographs and about 120 plus GPS units in all of Indonesia. So more funding, if supplemented with the right technical advice and greater data sharing across borders, would help. And finally, another area where more funding would help is promoting better building practices. Now I'm going to take a small digression and show you how many of you recognize this character here. Show of hands, okay? Woody Woodpecker. Now my daughter, when she was 4 years old, she used to love Woody Woodpecker. And I remember there was this episode once where Woody is in the forest, and Woody likes eating olives, and he has quite a few olives. He's satiated, but he can't resist. He pops in one more, keeps popping a few more, pops in one olive, and then what happens to Woody? He goes, poof. Right? Now, on a more serious note, when buildings crumble after heavy rains, like that olive, we point to lax building codes. But codes are only a proximate, not the underlying cause of the collapse. That olive did not cause Woody to explode, even though on the surface it may seem so. So likewise, it's not the lack of building codes that cause buildings to collapse necessarily. Why? Because codes work through institutions, and if made mandatory in weak institutional settings, they can do more harm than good by opening the door to rent-seeking and corruption. So think of the former USSR that had some of the best building codes on paper, but some of the shoddiest buildings. Now, typically after a disaster, the typical outcry is, oh, we need stronger and better and more enforced building codes. In the report, we actually argue against that for the reasons I stated. So what can you as a finance minister do? Well, we say that instead of narrowly focused on building codes, you can promote better building practices. And this requires encouraging and funding local institutions such as engineering groups and research universities, who are then better able to institute quality control mechanisms that are tailored to their local context. So increasing measures for funding for such initiatives would greatly help. I was informed recently by some of my colleagues who work on El Salvador that a country that's very prone to earthquakes, that the entire country has only 2 seismic engineers. So think about how vastly underfunded this particular section of society is. So that's the point. Increasing funding for such measures would help, and even modest increases could have huge benefits. So moving on to the third message, but beware, because effective prevention does not rest on a single measure or a simple slogan. Now, what do I mean by a single measure? We just spoke about the importance of weather forecasting and early warning systems. But funding early warning systems is only as useful as a last mile of successful evacuation and response. This is New Orleans, Katrina. And this last mile is often a local government responsibility. But if the public does not trust its local institutions, as you saw in Hurricane Katrina, even rich countries can stumble over this last step. So building and maintaining trustworthy institutions go beyond any single measure. What do I mean by simple slogans? Well, let's talk about critical infrastructure, which is a buzzword in the disaster community. We often talk about safe schools and safe hospitals for all. That's worthwhile. Who can argue against that, right? But why don't we ever talk about safe prisons for all? So think of what happened in Haiti in the earthquake when the main prison there collapsed in January, and all the 4,000 inmates in it were on the loose. So aren't safe prisons or other infrastructure equally necessary for a smooth functioning of the economy? So what is critical is not always what you think. Another point we make is, if everything is critical, then nothing is. The list has to be kept manageably small, especially if being on it attracts resources. And as we document in the report, the US has trouble doing so, keeping the list manageably small, and it's very likely that other countries do too. So what's critical depends on local conditions and the hazard. So in quake-prone Istanbul, hospitals are legitimately critical for treating injuries from quakes. But in flood-prone Bangladesh, water treatment plants may be more critical to prevent the outbreak from flood-borne diseases such as cholera or diarrhea. So you cannot just rely on simple slogans. So what's a good example of critical infrastructure? Some of you may be familiar with, that's the US example, by the way, that it initially included 13 sectors, up from 8 in 1995, now includes 13 sectors and 1,700 critical assets. Some of you may be familiar with Kuala Lumpur's SMART tunnel. The SMART is an acronym for Storm Management and Road Tunnel. So it's about 10 kilometers long at 3 levels. The upper 2 are for traffic, as the cars show, but the lowest one is actually drainage for floods. Now, I'm not an engineer, so let me show you a short video clip of how it works.
The project is called SMART, short for Stormwater Management and Road Tunnel. The SMART concept is surprisingly simple. First, build a massive 9.7-kilometer-long tunnel directly under Kuala Lumpur to safely funnel floodwaters from the Klang River at the north to the Karayong River in the south. Then, insert a 3-kilometer-long double-level toll roadway to help solve the city's traffic problems. Commuters can travel on the road decks while water flows below in a sealed flood channel. But that's not all. What makes the SMART design truly unique is a feature that would arm the city against a worst-case scenario. If a giant river surge is headed toward Kuala Lumpur, the 2 road decks could be evacuated and serve as additional flood channels to carry the raging waters underneath the city.
Okay, so that gives you an idea of what the tunnel is. This is truly smart infrastructure. It's a roadway that doubles as a drain, as and when the need arises. And I won't go into the history of SMART, but since it began in 2007, it's handled over 80-plus storm events. So combining the drain and road costs less than building the 2 separately. That's almost a no-brainer. But infrastructure like this requires insight, innovation, imagination. Many good decisions at many levels of government are required, underscoring again the importance of credible institutions that go beyond any single measure or simple slogans. So, what about the future? Well, the future of the disaster prevention landscape will be shaped by what we call the 3 Cs. Cities that are growing rapidly, a climate that is changing, and with that, the threat of climate-induced catastrophes, mega disasters on a global scale. So let's take the first C first, growing cities. So we find that growing cities will increase exposure to hazards. So I won't go into the technical details, but we developed this fancy demographic economic model to estimate how exposure in large cities would change by the year 2050. So the projected number of people exposed to tropical cyclones, so that's in 2000, rises from 310 million currently to about 680 million. For earthquakes, that number goes from 370 million to about 870 million. And much of this increase is in the Asia and Pacific regions. But is this bad news? This sounds horrible. More and more people are exposed to cyclones and quakes. Well, not necessarily, as we say in the report. And it's because even though rising densities increase exposure, they also allow cities to spread the huge, high fixed cost of protective infrastructure over these populations. And equally, if not importantly, more importantly, growing cities will make people richer. And this suggests they will better be able to protect and adapt themselves. So the point we make is exposure may rise, but vulnerability need not. A lot depends on how cities will be managed. Anyway, I should also say that while this phenomenon of growing cities is a pretty prevalent one, An equally important but often ignored one is that of shrinking cities. So cities that are not growing economically or demographically. So cities in the former socialist countries or even some in the US. And New Orleans is a great example. So New Orleans reached its peak of economic importance in the late 1850s. Right? Now after Katrina struck, and I want to make sure I get my numbers right, more than $200 billion of assistance would have been used to rebuild the city. Now that's the same as giving each resident a check for more than $200,000 in a place where annual per capita income is less than $20,000. So the trade-offs that shrinking cities face are truly difficult, but adequately addressing them can make the difference between poverty and prosperity. Well, the second C we analyze is our climate change-related disasters. Now, the methodology we employed is vastly complicated. It involves marrying physics and economics from over 4 general circulation models. The caveats are many. But I'm going to show you just 3 slides. But behind these 3 slides is the collective effort and 2-year-long interdisciplinary effort with some of the best climate scientists and economists in the world. And today I'm going to talk just about tropical cyclones because that's the most robust part of the analysis. So in simple terms, this is what we did. We started with what annual damages from tropical cyclones look like globally today. There are about $26 billion. We then assumed a world without climate change to see how these damages would change by the year 2100. And that's a green bar. So damages double to about $55 billion. And why do they double? Because people become richer, population's growing, so rising incomes means obviously proportionally you would have more damage. And then we added climate change on top under business as usual scenarios to see what happens to this green bar. Does it go up, remain the same, or go down? That then gives you the additional incremental contribution of climate change-induced damages. And this is what we found. So climate change tacks on another $54 billion of damages every year. And depending on assumptions, that ranges anywhere between $30 and $70 billion. But these damages are not expected to come in a steady stream. This is because climate change will make the rare and worst storms of today less rare. Now, this is the damage distribution for the current climate. So a $100 billion storm currently comes once every 100 years. And our calculations show that with climate change, the damage distribution shifts like this. So the same $100 billion storm now comes once every 56 odd years. So, and these damages will vary by location. So the US, Japan, and China are the worst hit. They bear 90% of the global damages. But when scaled by GDP, it's the smaller countries that suffer the most. So countries in the Caribbean and some in the Pacific. And the third C we discuss is catastrophe induced by climate change. So by catastrophe, we mean irreversible, deep future disasters with a global footprint brought on by the possible melting of the ice sheets or disruption of ocean currents and so on. But our focus is more on the economics. So we worked with colleagues from Harvard, Richard Zeckhauser and others, and Resources for the Future to develop a decision framework for managing such catastrophic risks. And basically what we propose is a flexible portfolio of measures that includes rapid mitigation measures and emissions reduction, large-scale adaptation efforts, and this peculiar thing called geoengineering. And the economics of it is pretty incredible. And we discuss that in the book. So we discussed all this, but the bottom line is that these 3 C's, cities, climate change, and catastrophe, possible catastrophe, shift the burden of prevention from individuals to governments. So we need institutions at all levels, all the way from community to global, to keep the future manageable. And the takeaway from all this is if we continue to live in a world unchecked with climate change, then adaptation and disaster risk reduction become two sides of the same coin. And for you, the finance ministers, the message is that you don't run cities. You cannot single-handedly solve the climate change problem, but you do control many aspects of the financing. So if you can help correct the problems of the present, generations to come will welcome the future. And that's what I meant by institutions. So now the other parts of the report or the book that I did not talk about today, we tackled some really tough and unexpected questions. Should all disasters be prevented? Should you put a dollar value on lives saved or damages avoided? Do disasters always increase conflict like the tsunami did in Sri Lanka? Or can they actually reduce it like the same tsunami did in Aceh? Does foreign aid help or hinder disaster risk reduction measures or prevention? But there is one particular part of the report I'd like to draw your attention to, and you can take your finance minister hat off and be a regular concerned citizen, because that part is a closing memo to the concerned citizen. Now, this memo is special to me because in it, two of my colleagues who survived major disasters, a 2001 Gujarat earthquake and a 2004 Indonesian tsunami, it's about their experiences. And their experiences pull together some common and instructive threads. In particular, how all of us, acting individually and through responsive governments, can not only survive, but thrive. So as somebody said, yesterday is not for us to recover, but tomorrow is for us to win or lose. So let me end on that note. Thank you.
So I think we have some time for questions, and if you just raise your hand, and then I can kind of keep track of who needs to go. Phil?
Fascinating project. Very rich, and there's lots of different questions that I'd love to discuss with you if there's more time. But in the interest of putting back on the finance minister hats, I'm interested in what type of governing structure, what kind of country are we finance ministers of, and how you might make this presentation to an audience or a government that might be less democratic, like might have stronger weaknesses in institutions, or your average citizen might have a different sense of value in relation to understandings of risk. How do you articulate the prevention into different type of governance?
So unsurprisingly, I have made this presentation to quote-unquote non-democratic governments. And this is the point I made, that institutions go beyond specific labels. And typically, we tend to associate institutions with democracies. But we find Cuba has some of the best early warning systems in place. Cuba is not a democracy. Malaysia has something, the SMART tunnel. Malaysia is not exactly the US when it comes to democracy, right? So the point is, institutions go beyond specific labels, and it's just difficult to say that institutions that are not democratic or don't have elements of that don't do a good job. So the evidence, if you look at the evidence out there, it cuts both ways. And my experience in presenting this sort of work to, I should be careful what I say because I'm being recorded, to client governments is, you never want to say, you never want to come across saying, oh, you should do this, you should do that, or you're doing this wrong. You always want to present examples of what's worked in other places and what's worked in their own context, and then have a debate and dialogue and then take it from there.
Early on, you mentioned something about disasters increasing the debt of countries.
Disasters
increasing the debt of countries?
It affects the fiscal deficit, yeah. Debt is different from deficit, but go ahead.
Was there any long-term effect on borrowing from those countries?
It depends on which countries you're talking about. So in the Caribbean, every time a hurricane strikes, the deficit increases and the debt increases because they have to borrow to rebuild and reconstruct. They're barely recovering from one hurricane before the other one strikes. So that is true for small countries that are not typically connected to the rest of the world economically, so to speak. But for large countries, not so. And as I mentioned, sometimes aid flows into these countries that helps with this financing gap at least. And in some countries, too much aid or the wrong kind of aid can also flow in.
So, given that you're working for an international organization, what's the role of international institutions in mitigating disaster risk? Most of your recommendations are on a national level.
Yeah, so as I said, institutions are required at all levels and even at global ones. So, I mean, we have various roles, and I could give you another talk on that, but let me simplify it into sort of 3 or 4 points. One is doing work like this, doing objective, analytical, empirical, conceptual work like this. So this is not just one piece of research, it's drawing from the global community at large, packaging it in a way that is digestible to policymakers and trying to influence policy. And I think that's our biggest value added in a way. Another is actually working at the country level, not just at the country level, but even at community levels, at subnational levels, and financing and funding projects. So we do a lot of work, building protective seawalls or just helping improve infrastructure, giving advice on debts and deficits to governments. Disasters, I mean, it's basically about development. I think if you were to summarize this report in one sentence, disasters and development go hand in hand. Disasters is not one specific sector. So we do anything that we do to help development sort of helps this cause, be it through balanced advocacy, research, analysis, funding projects, policy advice, so on and so forth.
I have 2 questions. First, kind of a follow-up to the question that was asked first. I mean, when you present this case to invest in disaster management, when you finance minister who has several other priorities, how do you essentially say that, hey, this is the amount you should be investing in disaster, which matters more than the other priorities that you might have said. And B, we have this constant argument about not investing in mitigation right now versus investing later when we're probably richer or when we have better technology available. So how do you kind of make that trade-off between mitigation now versus that?
Yeah. So on the first question, which was on how do you, just remind me again?
You said investing in disaster management when you have other priorities.
How do you quantify how much to spend where? Well, we can only give advice. So if a country is interested, then we work with them, we develop all sorts of technical models. But the key block is them wanting us to do this, them being convinced, and this relates to your second question, that this is a worthwhile cause. In terms of how do you convince them, I mean, that's basically what this work is about. It's balancing the P's and the R's.
Unfortunately, disaster management doesn't generally buy you votes, which is, I guess, one of the prime reasons why.
Yeah, so there's a whole, so there's this whole section on political economy of disasters that we have in the book. And that's a conventional wisdom that politicians are short-sighted and they don't respond to votes, they don't respond to such incentives, so on and so forth. Now again, the situation varies from country to country, but we did some empirical analysis, we worked with some political economists, and our take on that is that conventional wisdom needs a bit of rethinking. Because at the end of the day, politicians are responding to voters, at least in democratic institutions. So it's not that politicians are short-sighted just because they're politicians. They're responding in some ways, they're being reactive, they're responding to, you could say, the short-sightedness of voters. So the problem is not necessarily or not always with the politicians. It's about how communities organize themselves. But what is it that they want and prioritize that gets reflected in what politicians do. So I would challenge that, I do challenge that conventional wisdom in the book a bit. go ahead and read it.
You mentioned that it's important to make information more accessible to let more insurance companies and other institutions. I have actually a question about a very specific country. As China just experienced a very dramatic earthquake, the information is kind of hard to spread over to all these institutions. What's your suggestion for a country like China to make information more accessible?
Sure. So that question links to what was asked earlier on about what can international organizations do. That's another thing they can do. If we are using public funds to fund a piece of work or data collection or whatever have you, it's incumbent on us to insist that that information is made public. So that's, I'll come to your question, but that's another example of what international institutions do. And in fact, the World Bank is the first major international organization to have launched this open data initiative. I don't know how many of you have heard of it, about 2.5, 3 years back. So everything that we do, all data from our projects to research and everything is out there on the web. And it's opened this whole new way of sort of looking at things. That's another thing, that very important thing that the international organization can and should do more of. In China, we launched this report in China along with my former World Bank colleague, the chief economist, Justin Lin, who's gone back to China now. And it was interesting as to how this report was received. Let me give an analogy. When SARS struck China about 10, 15 years back, when it was, right? Yeah. So there were efforts to not let that information out. And as a result, I think over 800 plus people died. Now this time in the latest version of the, I forget the exact alphabet and numbering, the latest version of H1N1 virus came, the Chinese authorities were the first to sort of say, okay, we have this problem in our hands and we're going to take firm action. So when governments see the impact of the negative repercussions of trying to clamp down on information, right, that it can have on markets and whatever have you, they learn themselves. And this is a great example. So how China as a country itself has learned from its previous episodes.
Basically, for earthquakes, Chinese people are trying their best. Like a lot of people are driving directly to the earthquake place to try to see what they can help with. But it's actually unrational to do this because it causes a lot of traffic to get into the city, which make it a mess for the government to take actions. So I was just wondering, how do you get this information to the public to prevent them from some reasonable actions, something like that?
Well, in the case of, I don't know about that specific case that you were mentioning, but in the case of earthquake-prone countries, take Japan. Japan's a great example. They have drills, and it's built into their culture. So as school kids, you have to take seismic drills. You drive under desk chairs, whatever have you. So that's one way of getting information and building awareness out. The way why Cuba is so successful in warning its citizens ahead of hurricanes is because they constantly keep replaying clips from the past that show how devastating the impacts could be if you don't evacuate, right? So, there are various ways of getting information out. In this day and age, technology is, in Philippines, early warning systems are sent on your mobile phones through SMSs, text messaging, because mobile phone density is so high in the Philippines. So, there's no one right answer. It's so specific, it's so country context specific, but with the advances in technology, I think it's very, very difficult for governments to now clamp down on on information, although it does happen, but it's getting increasingly more difficult, which I think is a good thing.
Do you include climate change mitigation measures in your prevention possibilities?
To the extent that they may be linked to disaster, to extreme events. Yeah. Although there too, I mean, the calculus is very, very tricky, because the example I like to give is, suppose you were to wake up tomorrow and discover that this whole climate change problem has magically disappeared. Okay, just poof. We don't have to worry about climate change, the problem's been solved. Does that mean you need to stop worrying about disasters? The answer is a clear no. So the point I make is, even regardless of climate change, at least in many parts of the world, we're not doing a good job addressing disasters even without climate change. So let's worry more about what we can do right now. And then by taking care of that, to a large extent, at least climate change related issues could take care of themselves to the extent that they relate to disasters. Forest fires, yeah.
And sometimes of mine, in a year, decided to conduct a survey in some of these regions. So they get a sample and surveyed some people from villages both who suffered from the fires and who did not. And surprisingly, they found out that the popular support for government increased.
The what increased?
The popular support for government.
The popular support, huh?
Suffered the most in those villages. So, but it was easily explained because they just got the new reconstructed houses, and they were very happy with the government because they were provided with houses and aid and so on. And my question is, what can you say about not only the economics of the prevention, but about the politics of the prevention? So, if you consider that disaster is some sort of generous shock, and basically governments cannot be blamed for tornadoes, for tropical cyclones, for earthquakes. So if there is a chance for them to increase their popular support, so how can we persuade not only Minister of Finance, but also the President of political leadership to think about it properly, in case they can benefit from it?
Well, just on that last one, Haiti, the government has changed after the disaster. There were elections and a new president is in place. But listen, so we see that a lot, right? After a disaster happens, sure, people like to rush in providing support. Let me just caveat what I'm about to say by saying the focus in our work was to really focus on the ex ante, on the P's. I mean, there's a lot of literature on the R's as well, how to do relief, reconstruction, recovery better. But we wanted to just shift the focus from that to what you can do ex ante. I think I might challenge you a bit or disagree with you a bit on when you say that governments cannot control tropical cyclones. Sure, they cannot control the hazard, but their policies or lack thereof or misguided policies make all the difference between turning that hazard into a disaster. Right? So if I were to sort of say how can you prioritize ex ante stuff, I would say it depends on the 3 I's: information, incentives, and infrastructure. So as long as governments continue to take care of these 3 things together, we are in decent shape. Now, there are cases when, legitimately so, governments should rush in to provide relief and build homes or whatever have you. In fact, that's one of the things I didn't discuss today, is discussed in the book. Should all disasters be prevented? And we come out and say no, because the cost benefit of doing would be enormous. You cannot eliminate all risks. So every now and then you do have to take the hit, and every now and then you do have to have sort of ex post public reconstruction, recovery, whatever have you. But there the point we make is it's important to have these social protection mechanisms, but they should be in place. The system should be in place before, not after, because then it just goes haywire. As to the politics of it, it's tricky. It's again country and context specific. Beyond what I've already said, I don't think I have more to say on the Russia case specifically. Okay, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I think that this is a really wonderful example of the possibility of a better structure of governance.
Absolutely.
And how that might not simply mitigate the effects of disaster, mitigate the possibilities of disaster, or those P's that you talked about, prevention. But in many cases, there is a politics to governing, right, which might be quite different from effective governance. And there are all kinds of structural things which might mitigate against moving resources from one area of government to another. We have government agencies whose role is to mitigate the effects of disasters which have happened. But we don't have government agencies that are specifically dedicated to preventing the possibility of future disasters. Not many that certainly operate at a large enough scale to have the kind of vision and the kind of power that I see calling for. And so it seems to me that there are political changes, there are structural changes that would have to take place in order for this very hopeful and powerful understanding of governance and prevention to take place. What's your experience in taking this vision of governance to a variety of governments and a variety of kinds of situations? And how do they understand prevention as a kind of government intervention as opposed to mitigation of effects?
Yeah. So one of the points we make, and again it depends on the government we are talking to, but the general point is having so you have FEMA and the equivalence of FEMA is in many countries, as you should, okay? But having a Ministry of Disaster Prevention, or having another disaster management agency, especially in many developing countries, does not make sense for many reasons. One is these guys wouldn't know what to do, okay? Because disasters is the prevention side is such an interdisciplinary, intersectoral thing. So what we say is, don't expand your governance structure necessarily by creating yet another ministry or disaster management agency. Just if your existing ministries, if your existing structures can do a better job, that's well done. Second, by doing so, then you're diverting scarce resources into something that, again, these guys wouldn't know. I mean, put yourself in the shoes of the Minister of Disaster Prevention. What would you do on day one? Very little, I would imagine. So the point we make is, again, it depends on the particular governance structure of a country, but it's about focusing on the 3 I's. So whoever is responsible for information, make sure that there are laws in the country that do not prohibit the dissemination of information, especially that's based on based by publicly funded sources. Incentives. It's not just about government intervention. It's sometimes disaster prevention you can jack it up by taking government out, as in the case of distorted markets for land and real estate. So it's about development, That's the point. So if you can just develop, and we do have this sort of 3I framework, but it's underpinned by this one big I, which is institutions. And how do you develop credible institutions that are effective, responsive? I don't have the magic bullet. Acemoglu and Robinson don't too either. I mean, it's history, it's politics, it's culture. But until we don't get to that aspect of it, you know, it's sort of, I mean, caricaturing it a bit, it's a bit of window dressing. Uh-huh.
Just take information, for example.
Yeah.
So a tsunami warning system is, I can see immediately, right, how people would use that information, how that would make all the difference under certain kinds of circumstances, and how that would be a broadly understood and acted on piece of information. But let's take rising sea levels in coastal areas and in the resort areas or areas of high value coastal land that you talked about. We have governments that are actively suppressing that kind of information because there's a constituency.
I agree.
Right, which will lose value in that case.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So there are kinds of complications of politics that are always going to mitigate against making information more available, even under the best of circumstances.
I'm completely with you. No disagreements there. As I said, information is often suppressed because of spurious privacy, commercial, or security reasons. I mean, imagine some World War I legislation makes taking photographs from planes illegal in some countries. Right. When you need that, when you need accurate maps. So, I mean, so how do you break through this vested interest? I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, at the bare minimum, I would say that, I mean, again, this comes back to the role of what international agencies can do. I mean, we can nudge, we can press governments to release information or whatever have you. At least at the bare minimum, we can make sure that the work we do is out there in the public domain. But ultimately, it comes down to empowering citizens, making individuals, communities aware. Information, incentives, infrastructure. Underpinned by the big I, which is institutions.
I actually have just a small question.
Yeah.
This question of empowering citizens, what kind of empowerment are you talking about? Are you talking about empowerment to hold governments accountable at local or national levels, or are you talking about kind of community level or household level resilience?
It's both. It's both. For the most part, it's the former. But if you look at Haiti's history during the dark days, I mean, communities just couldn't get together. So if you, I mean, here I refer to Eleanor Ostrom's work, which I'm sure many of you must be familiar with, the fact that even communities have a strong self-interest to manage common property resources. So that's pretty well documented. So empowering communities to at least get to that point where they're able to, where they have the incentive to take care of their common property. That did not happen in Haiti. That didn't happen in many other countries. So it's at the community level and this broader governance issue of holding your leaders accountable.
I just want to return to investment incentive for a second and market distortion.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, it's very easy to see, given the example of rent control, for example, how that creates deferred maintenance, how that deferred maintenance causes predictable collapse of annual storm systems during the monsoons, or other kinds of very predictable consequences of something like that. But we might take another example of the possibility of removing an incentive that distorts markets. And one thing is subsidized flood insurance in the United States. If flood insurance wasn't publicly subsidized, loans would be unavailable for property that was in the worst of the flood zones. That would decrease loss of life, that would decrease property losses. Right? But how could that possibly be politically palatable?
So I'm glad you mentioned that. So we discussed the U.S. example in great detail in the book. And you know, we worked with, I don't know if you guys know Howard Conrather and others from the Water and Risk Management Center who've been working on the flood insurance program in the U.S. for quite a while. And I'm completely with you. I think in some cases, insurance premium should be so high, so unaffordable that no one should be incentivized to live there. I mean, I don't know if I'm representing what you just said, but I think that's what you were saying, right? So,
that would be the result, right?
Yeah.
That would also be consequential, right? Because that would also affect the housing market more generally, given a limited.
but in a positive way or in a negative way? I'm not sure. I mean, if your concern is, okay, you're outpricing the vulnerable and the low-income groups from buying insurance, you can think of insurance vouchers, for example. I mean, there are other ways to address that issue of reaching out to the people in the lowest income strata. But having a general subsidy that keeps insurance premium low, you're just incentivizing more and more building on floodplains. Florida is a classic example. Every time there's a storm, then you have the usual. I mean, it's the bailouts basically. So I think insurance premium should be. So that's another example of government intervention, whereby withdrawing from the market, letting the market set the rate would be a good thing on balance. Yeah. Sorry, there was a question you had, and then I'll take you. Yes, definitely. I mean, this for 1 year after this book was published, I was literally on the road. I mean, I don't know, 300 plus days out of 365 days, and it wasn't just finance ministers or governments. It was anybody who wanted to hear me speak about this, and my other colleagues too. So we presented this to civil service organizations. I mean, it's created a huge splash in the Red Cross. The Secretary General of the Red Cross got a draft of the report. He endorsed it, and he went out and sort of. So we've had. It's not just me. We've had many members of our team going out and interacting with anybody who's interested. And that was the purpose. One of the objectives I set for myself when I took on this project was this would not be a economist speak sort of publication or project, because I'm willing to bet my next paycheck that each one of us here has been affected by disasters, either directly or indirectly. We ourselves have either been directly affected or we know somebody who's been affected. So this is a thing that concerns each one of us, and so we really wanted to do this very interdisciplinary effort and take it out to as many people as possible. Media organization, I mean, I could go on and on, but it's not, just to let you know, it's not just finance ministers or heads of state. Why
don't we take one last question, and then we'll continue discussion over food and drink. So Carlos, did you have one? Or?
I've been asking a lot.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, please.
Okay, my question was jumping off that last question about insurance. Do you foresee things like insurance agencies and such remedying this lack of information? For example, even if the government's saying, hold up, you can't say how much flooding there's going to be. Obviously, insurance agencies are going to have a strong incentive to figure out how much real flooding there will be.
Yeah, but it's not easy to do. So in some cases, the short answer is, yeah, they do have the incentive, and you do see them developing their own models for all sorts of things. But at the end of the day, they do have to rely on a certain public good aspect of information. It's not possible for an insurance company to set up a satellite or have flood monitoring stations anywhere and everywhere. So there's so empowering citizens, individuals is great, but it has to be supplemented by enough good, effective public goods provision. So it's really, at the end of the day, it's a job of the government. And they have all sorts of interests incentives not nearly to do as much as they could. Let's put it that way.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank Dr. Sanghi for coming to speak to us today, and for providing such a fascinating talk and an interesting discussion with everyone.